I want you to think if you've ever been to New Orleans. I've been many times. Mardi Gras, I've marched in parades. I've seen a lot of other parades, been to Bourbon Street, did the whole. Yeah, I've had some interesting times in New Orleans. Um, if you've ever been to the states of Kansas or Oklahoma or Colorado, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Wyoming, Montana, all of those states, all the way down to Louisiana and down to New Orleans in particular, comprise the western drainage zone of the Mississippi River. And that territory used to belong to the French Empire until the French and Indian War happened and they lost that. They actually, instead of giving it to the British, they ceded it to the Spanish, who were the lesser of two evils at the time. So New Orleans, as we know it today, used to be a part of the Spanish Empire for the better part of 40 years. That's why when you go to Bourbon Street, you see some of the side streets, you would think that they would have like French names. Some of the side streets are actually in Spanish. Calle Esplanada instead of Rue Esplanade. Bourbon Street, you would think has French architecture in some of its buildings. There's actually pretty heavy Spanish influence on Bourbon Street. The reason why I mention this is because several different things were coming into play. First and foremost, Thomas Jefferson likened the idea of the United States eventually being coast to coast along North America. The original 13 colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. We doubled the size of our country all the way to the Mississippi River and through the Great Lakes as a result of winning the Revolutionary War and the Treaty of Paris. Eventually, Thomas Jefferson wanted to see the United States make its way all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Many influential Americans believe the same. They believed that we would eventually go all the way to the Pacific. Thomas Jefferson was a very big proponent of such. A couple different things were in the way. Oh, that territory, it's not ours. Oh, and then there's even further territory to the southwest, which is also not ours. Okay? Let's bring back France. France, which had its French Revolution in 1789 and their new government, somewhat hostile, would eventually be taken over by Napoleon Bonaparte, who deemed himself eventually first consul of France, which is basically the ruler of France, an emperor. Emperor Bonaparte, Napoleon as we know him, had grand visions for the French Empire and restoration thereof. Part of it was he wanted to wrest India from the British Empire. He also wanted to restore French influence in North America. And in the early 1800s, just as Thomas Jefferson was taking power of the presidency in the United States, Napoleon negotiated the Treaty of San Ildefonso with the Spaniards to cede the Louisiana Territory from New Orleans all the way through that massive swath drainage area back to France. He wanted to build another French influence in North America. And he had designs elsewhere around the world. Okay? France, lost a lot of prestige as a result of that French and Indian War. They gained a little bit of it back by helping the fledgling United States win its independence after it had been declared. Napoleon wanted there to be a strong American influence, and he wanted there to be a French North American empirical design, starting with New Orleans. Originally, Thomas Jefferson wasn't quite aware of Napoleon's ambitions, but they would soon help each other. You see, Napoleon Bonaparte had this idea that not only would the old French Empire in North America be restored, he had other designs for Europe as well. Couple different things. Just before the Spaniards ceded over control of New Orleans and the Louisiana Territory back to France, they basically revoked the Pinckney Treaty in 1795, which allowed United States merchant ships up the Mississippi River and to use the port of New Orleans for trade under Spanish authority. The Spaniards revoked it, and then the French took over. Okay. Thomas Jefferson would send Robert Livingston to France to negotiate not just American authority to navigate the Mississippi River, especially because that was the western boundary of the United States at the time, but he went a step further. He would go to France and offer to Napoleon Bonaparte money in exchange for New Orleans. He wanted to buy New Orleans from the French. Napoleon had a couple different dilemmas at the time. Napoleon had trouble in what is present-day Haiti on the island of Hispaniola. Okay, back then it was Saint-Domingue, but we know it today as Haiti. That used to be a French colony. There was revolutionary uproar there that he needed to squelch, and he needed resources to squelch such revolutionary movement. Also, he had various different exploits in Europe at the time. He had some naval ships that he was going to send to the Americas to build more of a military influence in North America, but they got stuck in the winter of 1802 in a Dutch harbor. They got frozen out. And by the time the spring came around and things thawed out, other things were going on in Europe at the time for Napoleon. Napoleon needed money. He was going to conduct various different wars in Europe. He failed to wrest India from the British, but he had other designs for growing French imperial expansion in Europe itself. So while he really wanted North America in its French aspect back, he decided European design is a little bit more pressing right now, and I need money. So, Mr. Livingston, I see your offer for New Orleans. I'm going to offer you the entire Louisiana Territory, beginning with New Orleans. Okay. Thomas Jefferson wants to increase the size of the United States, and he wants eventually to go to the Pacific. This new territory, that offer, that would accomplish a massive part of that. That is extremely enticing. We don't know if we really have the authority to do that. Robert Livingston and James Monroe were the American diplomats who were negotiating with Napoleon Bonaparte. So Napoleon's plans crumble, but he offers money to the United States, and Livingston and Monroe negotiate with Napoleon on a $15 million amount. For $15 million, Napoleon Bonaparte would agree to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States. Two different problems. One, Monroe and Livingston didn't know if they had the authority to do it. And then not only that, they didn't know, second problem, they didn't know if Thomas Jefferson would either A, approve it, or B, if he had the authority to do it himself. The Constitution was still a fledgling document at that time, open for interpretation. But given that basically they could get the Louisiana Territory for what would equate to about 3 cents an acre, and so as not to lose the opportunity while they had Napoleon there, they decided to agree to it, and they signed the document that would agree to have the United States government pay the French government $15 million for control of Louisiana Territory, including New Orleans. Okay. Basically, it's the do an ask for forgiveness mantra comes into play. Instead of asking for permission, they would ask for forgiveness down the line. Hey, we did this. We don't know if we had the authority to do it, but it seemed like such a great deal. Yeah. It'd be kind of like somebody coming up to you and offering you a Ferrari and saying, hey, here's this brand spanking new Ferrari. I can't keep it right now because I need to focus on this 18-wheeler over here. But I'm willing to sell it to you for a bargain. That Ferrari cost $300,000, but I'll sell it to you for $50,000. Ooh, ooh. If that were me, I would try and take that deal because it's a Ferrari, right? For $50,000, you can get a Ferrari as opposed to $300,000, and it's brand new in mint condition. This guy's just desperate for money. He needs something because he's got other things on his mind. That's essentially what happens here. So Monroe and Livingston come back, and Thomas Jefferson is immediately impressed, and he is immediately enthralled with this. He's loving it, but he's also a little bit embarrassed. Thomas Jefferson is embarrassed because he himself does not know if he has the constitutional authority to approve such measure. Eventually, it would be deemed that by signing a treaty, it would become constitutional and legal. April 30th, 1803, the Louisiana Territory officially becomes a part of the United States. And the United States, which had doubled in territory as a result of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, doubled in size, further doubles in size. And essentially, the United States now becomes 2/3 of what it would eventually become. You double the size of your national territory. So now what? You have this new vast territory. Immediately, Thomas Jefferson wants to see what's there. We don't even know what's there. People think it's just this empty, vast western area, when in reality, it's inhabited by a boatload of Native Americans. Yeah, some of them are pretty hostile. Unfortunately for the Native Americans, there was a smallpox epidemic that wiped out quite a number of them in the early 1800s, which led to the further belief that white settlers are going to move out there because there's nothing there, including nothing but dead Native Americans. That wasn't quite the case, but that was the belief at the time. So Thomas Jefferson has this idea that we're going to see what's there. By the way, in that Louisiana territory, you have New Orleans itself. Had been established by the French, ceded to the Spanish, and then back to the French, and now the United States. All white folks in New Orleans who were perhaps of French descent would be automatically declared United States citizens as part of the Louisiana Territory. And in 1812, what we know now as the state of Louisiana was approved for statehood, and it became officially a part of the state of Louisiana. Okay? The rest of the territory would eventually be divided into what eventually would become states that we know today. But otherwise, Thomas Jefferson wanted to know what was there. And he commissioned Meriwether Lewis, this 29-year-old former Army soldier who fought against Native Americans and had learned various different Native American ways. And his colleague, William Clark, would explore this new area. The Lewis and Clark expedition would sail up the Missouri River from St. Louis, Missouri, and make their way to the Columbia and Snake Rivers all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And over the course of 2 years, they would explore western lands. They would encounter Native Americans, of which one they had as a guide, Sacagawea, a Native American lady who served as an interpreter and otherwise cultural representative for the United States on behalf of Native Americans. Lewis and Clark would eventually make their way to the Pacific Ocean off the Oregon coast. And then they would make their way back to St. Louis and report massive aspects of their ordeals. The Lewis and Clark expedition opened the idea that the West is vast and there's vast opportunity. One final thing, though. Remember that guy, Alexander Hamilton, the guy in the $10 bill who created the First National Bank of the United States? He rears his head again because Aaron Burr, the Vice President of the United States, had lost the 1800 election, largely because Alexander Hamilton favored Thomas Jefferson over Aaron Burr, thereby gaining Thomas Jefferson enough votes to take the presidency. But really ran Aaron Burr really wrong. But the rivalry didn't end with the election of 1800 when Thomas Jefferson wins the presidency. It goes a little bit further. See, Aaron Burr was a New Yorker. And there was this movement at the time of Federalists who were anti-Louisiana Purchase. Because if you have more territory further out west, you're going to dilute Northeastern political influence. Federalists were already feeling that loss of power. Now you're going to dilute it even further by adding new territories and perhaps new states. That rubs a lot of folks northeast the wrong way. And some folks up in the Northeast, including in New England, want to secede from the Union and create their own Northeastern Confederacy. They would need New York to do that. There were folks in the Northeast who approached Aaron Burr to perhaps support such movement. And he may have been reluctant, but what really drew his hand was that these Federalists approached the staunch Federalist Alexander Hamilton, and Alexander Hamilton, as Federalist supporting as he was, soundly rejected the idea of there being a secession. When these folks wanted Aaron Burr to run for governor of New York, Alexander Hamilton went on this tirade basically denouncing Aaron Burr's character. He was a shady figure. He was untrustworthy. He was not worthy of being your governor. He should not have been your vice president in the first place, which is why I favor Thomas Jefferson overall anyway. The long feud between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton would eventually come to a head. Aaron Burr would lose that election, and he would blame Alexander Hamilton for slandering him. And he would come to blows with Alexander Hamilton, and he would offer an old-fashioned duel. Aaron Burr was so incensed with Alexander Hamilton that he challenged him to a duel, a gun duel. Aaron Burr Alexander Hamilton didn't want to look weak. So he accepted that duel. And in 1804, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr would have their duel. Alexander Hamilton's shot missed. Aaron Burr's shot didn't. And Alexander Hamilton would die the next day. Okay? In the portrayal of Hamilton in the Broadway production, it's as a result of the election of 1800 when Alexander Hamilton, even though he's at political odds with Thomas Jefferson, he favors Jefferson over his rival Aaron Burr. And that causes the duel. That was not the reason. That was the step leading up to the reason. That was just one of the additional factors. It culminated in Alexander Hamilton denouncing Aaron Burr's run for governor. Culminated in a duel. Eventually, Aaron Burr would try and escape and make his way out to the Louisiana Purchase. Some people think that he wanted to maybe try and wrest Mexico from Spain. That's kind of hearsay. But otherwise, he was eventually captured and brought back and tried, but he was acquitted when the Supreme Court, under John Marshall, said that they didn't have enough evidence to truly convict him. And he would live the remainder of his life in relative obscurity. But otherwise, though, that ended Alexander Hamilton's life. What an interesting time. We're starting off the Jeffersonian era in American history. Death, expansion, and the American way.